morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Minas Tsamopoulos, journalist at Proto, Thema, and I'm delighted to welcome you in this Fireside chat with very distinguished Andonis Lemos. I'm honored to moderate this discussion with Andonis Lemos, Vice President of Union Greek Shipowners, and along with his brother Philippos, runs the Enesel group. We are glad to have you here with us. Thank you for accepting our invitation. In this short session, let's start the questions.
Let's do that.
Adonis, there is no doubt that decarbonization of shipping is the top item of agenda today. How prepared do you think the industry is for this major change?
Well, firstly, thank you for having me here, Mina, and thank you to the Delphi Economic Forum for inviting the union and giving us the opportunity to tell you what we think. I think that I can give you a very brief answer. I think, we're as prepared as we ever are for regulatory change. We're a global industry. Greeks are leaders in it. And if you take all the regulatory changes that have happened over the last 30 years, we've adapted fast, efficiently, and we've improved our industry every time that regulations have been put upon us. So I think we are on our way to being ready, and we will be ready in good time.
Greeks are the first every time that implements new regulations.
I would say we're leaders. I think there are many good shipowners. Everywhere. We're not leaders everywhere, but we have one of the youngest shipping fleets in the world. We're innovators. We reinvest in our fleet. And as such, in this particular area, we're leaders.
Let's go to the second question. What, in your opinion, are the parameters that will help towards accelerating shipping's progress to becoming a greener industry? And what do you believe are the weaknesses in the EU ETS scheme? A long question.
Very quickly, for the benefit of the audience here, on the 18th of April, shipping was signed into the EU ETS scheme. So we will now have to purchase carbon credits to set off our emissions. In principle, this is being applied to all heavy industries across Europe, and I think it will, to a degree, stimulate change. I think there's a few major errors in the particular scheme. The most important one is that in the past, when the ETS was first initiated, and in the voluntary schemes today, you can earn credits. And there's absolutely no way of earning credits in this particular scheme, and that's a massive mistake. It doesn't stimulate innovation in any way whatsoever. So by that I mean, if you can only buy credits, all carbon capture needs to be ship-based. And it doesn't take into account the emissions that are produced in that carbon capture, in creating those instruments. By that I mean, you need to build scrubbers to capture carbon. You need to install them. That in itself creates carbon emissions. You need to then dispose of the carbon. So in the hundreds, thousands of ports globally, you'll have to have all the pipes, all the carbon capture systems to discharge the carbon you've captured.
It's a huge problem and to store it.
And you will carry, exactly, you will have less cargo carrying capacity. And you will burn fuel to capture that carbon. If the ETS allowed you to earn, and this applies to aviation, to cement, everything, if it allowed you to earn credits, you would be able to have huge economies of scale because you could capture carbon onshore. And you could buy those credits and you could set them off there. And that would stimulate huge innovation because you could have massive, eventually when the technology is there, massive carbon capture schemes onshore. They could be wind-powered, they could be solar-powered, they could be hugely efficient. You wouldn't reduce the carbon carrying capacity of ships. And you could buy those and trade them. And being a capitalist, I mean, I'm left-wing in education and healthcare, but being a capitalist, I believe you need to release man's imagination. You need to give them incentive to develop schemes. And you want people to put money into these projects, not just ship owners on their ships. And so for me, whether it's aviation, shipping, or cement, the fact that you cannot earn credits and you cannot invest in technologies, and those technologies be able to sell those credits and make money is a horrendous mistake. I'm sure it will eventually be addressed. It's totally political.
It's a tax.
It's effectively a tax, and now we don't even have, an ocean fund anymore. So other than $2 billion euros, very little of the money that's taxed, the EU consumer will ultimately pay it because it's, only within the EU, trades that come into the EU or come out of the EU, 50% of the voyage, that has to pay a carbon credit. It'll be politicians who decide how that money is spent. And I have nothing against politicians, but if you're the representative of Bergamo and you're given money, you're going to be incentivized to spending that money in Bergamo, as opposed to necessarily, if it was a ship, an ocean fund investing it in specific technologies to capture that.
How you can secure that?
Well, firstly, I think the EU is, the biggest trading bloc in the world and the highest GDP as the EU 28 in the world, should be trying, much like the container or the dollar, to be creating, through IMO actually, a single currency, a single carbon currency, so that one day when there's an ETS in China or an emission trading scheme in America or Singapore, you can trade your particular carbon credit on any of those schemes and create pricing efficiency and allow that money to be invested in the most efficient places in the world.
It's a very vital proposal, I think.
I think, for a global trade...
I heard it for the first time, I admit it.
Well, it is being, it's discussed, and it's a the EU politicians have a disincentive to do that because they would, they would lose this captured amount of money that they can, just like late last year, they issued $25 billion of credits. They don't account for where that money is going. They don't account for how it's going to be spent. And, that's not how it should work. Not if the real goal is to reduce carbon in the atmosphere and secure a brighter future, for our children, would be my opinion.
So, if you can't avoid it, you can shape it.
I think it's vital to try and shape it. That's one of the reasons I'm, sitting here today. I think that's one of the, the main things that the Union of Greek Shipowners will try to do going forwards is to say that, well, we have, the regulation is a fait accompli, so we should live within it and we should try to shape it so it actually achieves its goals and, ultimately is less of a burden to the EU consumer. We all want to cut inflation, we all want cheap transportation, we all want cheap goods.
So going back to the issue of energy transition, what do you think of the many different initiatives, both regulatory and other,
well, I think it
that
should
spring up in order to pave the way?
I think it should lead, IMO should lead. But I think that, the Carbon Intensity Index, CII, has many, many faults. And in that regard, the EU ETS is much better because it, actually measures your emissions. And so you have an incentive to fill your ship to the full and burn your fuel most efficiently. When you have something which is, the CII, which is done on deadweight, you have an incentive, or you don't have a burden to having ballast legs. So it's a disincentive to triangulation, to having every leg of a voyage loaded or to loading your ship to the full, for example. And you're measured on deadweight per year. So if you're sitting idle or if you're not working your ship, you're still billed for it. So you're incentivized to continuously move your ship. This is for me, it's poorly thought out legislation, but IMO has a major role. And seeing as the EU is leading with ETS, IMO should try and create a global regulatory environment around that, is my personal belief. Perhaps not the unions, but I think it's inevitable.
Who's going to follow the IMO regulations?
Well, everyone has to.
Has to.
I mean, it's not, it's not a question of who is going to. It's a question of you have to. Just like you have to follow the ETS. So the question is, invariably, like when a child is born, when regulation is born, it needs to be refined, it needs to be improved, and there's a discussion to be had there.
From cradle to grave, huh?
Well, I think, I just think that, if you're going to measure emissions, you have to, as I said before, you have to measure them cradle to grave. You can't just look at it in that moment, but you have to look at what it causes. And you certainly shouldn't have regulations necessarily which encourage the scrapping of relatively young ships for the rebuilding of new ships. Because that iron ore, that coal has to be moved. it has to smelt that coal, you have to rebuild the ship, you have to create new ships. It's much better to try and make existing ships more efficient or tax them in a way where the monies from that tax go to technologies which allow those ships, to be more efficient, cleaner fuels, better fuels, or, as I said, and I really believe, onshore carbon capture.
Let's move on. How do you think the Greek shipping performs?
Well, I mean, all you need to do is read, the president's speech or listen to it. We're global leaders in probably one of the most competitive, industry in the world, and by that I mean, there are very few barriers to entry. You can come into this industry and you can compete in it around the world. You can become the most efficient and you can shine. And in that regard, that we control over 20% of world shipping, over 60%, close to 60% of Europe shipping. I think it speaks to itself. I think the numbers answer that question. I don't need to.
Let's go to another question. What are the benefits of shipping to the European and global economy? Well, now we have these geostrategic issues.
Well, I think peace is probably, the greatest thing that international trade has ever offered the world. When nations trade with each other, they have incentive not to go to war. Clearly, there are exceptions to that, and we could have a long debate about it, but essentially, the post-Second World War global, call it Pax Americana, has been highlighted by producing things in China, bringing those components to California, selling the world cheap phones, and it's hugely disinflationary, and we've brought, an incredible number of people, more people than ever on this planet, are middle class and live much more comfortable lives, and that's thanks to trade. And you're not really going to go to war with your biggest trading partner, if your economies are intertwined. And so I see shipping as a major key in global peace.
But we see that globalization wasn't secure peace.
Well, I don't agree with you, and I think, decoupling is something that will happen, and it'll be transitory, and it won't happen to such a big extent. I mean, maybe we won't sell chips to China, but you can be damn sure we're going to buy, cheap washing machines and cheap phones, from them and from Vietnam and from everywhere else, and they will benefit from it, and their populations will, benefit from it, and they will develop a good middle class. And, if we want the world's population, I'm going to get carried away here, but if we want the world's population to top out at like 10 billion people as opposed to 14 billion people, the best way is for them to be educated, to be relatively wealthy, to have pension schemes so they don't have to have 7 children to take care of them when they're old, and that's the best way to save the world. I sound like Jordan Peterson, but, he's right.
What is the role that shipping plays in global economy?
Well, I think
we have the pandemic. We saw a lot of things.
Well, I think I think it's in the pandemic, it kept the world supplied with food, it kept the world supplied with goods, and medicine. It was the only, and medicine, obviously. I didn't know this until recently. The U.S. actually makes no antibiotics. The U.S. makes no antibiotics, so if ships didn't move, I guess you could move them around on planes, but, essentially shipping kept the world moving. It was the only industry which didn't stop. And actually, and it's often forgotten, it's not highlighted because they have it doesn't cost a politician anything if they upset sailors or seamen in any way, but at great cost to the families and the lives of those who work at sea. People were staying on board 11, 12, 14 months. What we call developed and educated nations, we're not allowing people to disembark and go back to their homes to see their families. I think they were completely forgotten and abused, and I think actually it's a disgrace and a stain on civil society. But shipping navigated that and kept the world supplied and gets very little praise for it, and I think that's a shame.
So, talking about shipping, about the European crisis with the Ukrainian crisis, I want to ask you, what is your concern about the sanctions imposed by Europe on Russia? It's a bit complicated.
No, I don't think it's that complicated. I think and some people in this room may raise their eyebrows, but I think to a degree, the sanctions have been effective. You look at Russia's free reserves, they've completely collapsed. Russia is making less money, and that is stressing Russia. And that is the ultimate goal. You know, Russia having to sell its crude oil and its product at capped prices is having an effect. I believe, and I say I here because I can't necessarily say I'm speaking for the Union on this part, but I believe that Europe made an error, and it was purely for political, you know, weight in saying that European refineries can't buy Russian crude at or above the cap. It's been great for ship owners. You know, it's been great. Well, this is why I say I'm not speaking necessarily for the Union, but it's been great for ship owners because the Indians, the Saudis, the Chinese, they buy Russian crude at the cap, they refine it, and we transport the diesel back to Europe.
More ton miles, huh?
And the European consumer suffers from inflation. You know, you have people whose electricity costs around Europe have gone up 3 times, and the ton miles improved, and that's maybe been a benefit to shipping. It's been terrible for Europe. And why should other nations benefit from the pressures that we rightly want to put on Russia? There's no logic to it other than it's good politique. It's rubbish realpolitik.
I think everybody benefits except Europe.
And Russia.
My last question, Adonis, do you see the new trading routes that have developed due to the Ukraine crisis continue after the war is over? Is this how it will be going?
I said this earlier. I think shipping is, you know, a prime example of one of the most efficient industries in the world. And depending on when the war ends or how the war ends or on what grounds peace is established, you know, new trading routes or old trading routes will reappear and shipping will adapt to those immediately. I'm not in a position to predict when peace comes, on what grounds it will come. But if Russia's able to trade freely, again, then, you know, LRs are not going to be moving diesel from India to Europe. You know, it'll be coming direct from Russia because that's the most efficient way, and that's exactly the way it should be happening.
And we have 2 minutes. Can we talk about the benefits of shipping for Greece? Greece, a small country.
Well, I think, you know, I think it gives us a geopolitical voice that other things wouldn't give us, and that's a benefit. And you know, it gives us an exposure to the world that is completely outsized for our population and our economic size. So I think it's great in that regard. I think that as more and more of the Greek ship owners are based in Greece, it creates, you know, the opportunity for technological hubs and educational hubs in Greece. And, you know, I hope that the future leaders of Greece will, you know, capitalize on that and invest in, you know, the abilities to educate and train our seamen here in Greece and, you know, possibly global seamen as well. We should be a leader in that area. The President of the Union is a leader in the thinking on that, and, you know, I praise her for that. And I think it creates jobs. And, you know, shouldn't just look at the jobs which are created by people who work directly in shipping, but they're well-paid jobs. And therefore, there's a multiplier effect. Those people who work in shipping companies, they build homes, they have nannies, they send their kids to schools, and that in itself recirculates and creates a multiplier effect to the money, and that money stays in Greece. Some of it leaves, but a lot of it stays in Greece, and that's very important for Greece.
Adonis, I want to thank you to be with us.
Minas. It was fun.
It was a great opportunity to listen to your opinions.
It was much less scary than I thought, so thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.